We're already recording.
Oh,
And I was kind of looking, I was getting my face up really close. I couldn't read too many titles on your bookshelf, but
oh
I
yeah.
see behind on your right shoulder, I can see the word Novalis there. Um,
Oh yeah.
that's kind of a close up. You know, what's the book
That's
below
that's
that that's white that says,
that's Yaka Burma's Aurora.
oh, okay.
That actually that shelf that might be the only organized shelf. There's a couple that are organized, but
Yeah.
that's mostly Sophiology, like Sophiology's greatest hits.
Yeah. Illich once talked about like, and it can sound kind of pompous, I suppose, or, but the notion that for people who lived in the age of the book, and for him, almost like what we'll talk about today in some sense, eons, what's going on, the cauldron's on the boil. But he talked about in the age of the book prior to, and the way we looked at ourselves as almost books. And the sacrament of confession, we would go in and read off an inner text, and how
Mhm.
that's kind of flattened out with a computer. Anyhow, some of those fun things that there was a type of knowledge of like where books were on a bookshelf, where that line was, even if you didn't know exactly what page, you knew this line that meant so much to you was on the right hand corner of the page. And he
Hmm.
had about seven of those things. And again, you could talk about that in some way that would make you feel or make you look to others as being kind of pompous or something. But as you know, there's a distinct pleasure in that, and he would say, he comes to us as having like flattened out consciousness to the age of the book, kind of depth that helped with depth. And you see St. Augustine, Confessions. And then the possibility is we could be going into a new era of higher consciousness, but that could get derailed. That could get
Hmm.
derailed into something like our brains looking like a computer, which is a wild, unplanned segue into the topic I kind of wanted to talk about today.
Well,
But like,
well,
yeah,
well,
what's going on?
before,
Yeah, tell me.
before I
Any
go there, I mean, I
reactions?
think to
Yeah.
what germane to what you're saying and what Illich is saying. Um, even though I spent
Yeah, I don't need
a
to go
lot of
anywhere
time
but
every
here.
day
Yeah.
editing books on my computer. Um, I resist as much as possible reading a book on a computer or a screen.
Yeah.
I mean, I just
I
don't do it.
do it. Oh, see, I resist as much as possible, but I'm probably weak. I do it
But
way too much.
that doesn't mean I don't. I mean, I read Substacks and stuff on,
Yeah,
you know
yeah,
what I mean?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I read out, and there are some books you just can't find a hard copy of, like
No, no.
my beloved Eleanor Fargen. I've been trying to find her book Trees, which is one of my favorite books ever, in a hard copy. Can't find it anyplace. In fact, I was talking to my publisher. I said, "You got to put this book out."
Okay.
I'll
Huh.
write an introduction, put this out, maybe another one of her poetry books to combine them. Because Eleanor Fargen, I think, is one of the most important writers of the 20th century, and nobody knows about her.
We know her through some of her hit songs, like "A Morning Has Broken," right?
That's right.
But
And she
just
also,
give her, yeah, similar. Yeah.
that Advent hymn, "People Look East."
People look east and round
That's the
today.
one.
It's the season
That's
of
hers.
the year. That's a great
That's
tune.
hers
Yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah.
And she wrote both of those tunes before she became a Christian.
Wow, wow, wow. That's great. But yeah, so
Like
that's super
decades
relevant.
before she. What?
Yeah. I think, but talking about that huge meta history, I could say like there's this guy, Andrei Navrazov, who used to write for Chronicles magazine. Back in the day, I did
Yeah.
a few articles for them. He was this Russian emigre, really funny. But he was reviewing a book, and this title was popular for a while, but these books came out like the Gutenberg Elegies, remember that? About
Hmm.
again a flattening out of consciousness. Um, but they would go from this pattern I like is from original oneness to alienation to what Barfield called final participation. It's the one I like. I'm not selling it to well, I'll sell it to people, but I can't prove it's true. But in an analog with that, you had kind of a caveman consciousness, which was cotentive. It was a widespread, unfocused awareness. You kind of knew so much, you heard so much. And
Hmm.
then the axial age a little bit, the book. And we want to talk a little bit astrology today to have John Michael Greer's text
Oh yeah.
tweet all dialed up. But the
I'm glad you do. I was gonna get it.
good, good, yeah,
I was
it's
gonna load
good.
it up too.
Yeah,
But
and
before,
so
yeah,
yeah, go
but
say.
before, you know, um, so. probably through the pandemic. There was, in fact, our a friend Tara, right? Uh, she was doing this too. Like, the idea of, where, and I think this is what going to be have everything to do with what we talk about today, but how the archons were trying to kind of herd everybody online, into ant farms and make everything digital, and so I spent a lot of time, or well, my whole life,
Work
but
from
especially in
home
the
on your
past,
computer. Yep. Yep.
past few years, hoarding books.
Yeah.
Like go to like rummage sales or yard sales or used bookstores and just kind of hoarding hard copy books for
Yeah.
for the day in which they don't exist. I mean, it's like Fahrenheit 451, right?
Yeah.
When they won't exist, because we know if they move everything digitally, that, and we've already seen this happen where they have been editing, like say Jane Austen or somebody, to make it more woke, or not, woke is probably not the right term, but more socially acceptable.
Uh-huh.
That they have, some, or they might have some misogynist themes, or they might
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
no girl bosses or whatever, right? So I think that there's a case to be made for that, for
Yeah.
for hoarding
Yeah.
actual books.
No, again, it's like, and I would put it in the context of like a true or false final participation, a true or
Hmm.
false circle two. That whether we're going to go the technocratic, no authorship, right? You didn't used to have authorship, or the history of the muse. We'll talk about that. But then you get the age of the book, and is that going to lead to kind of a higher resolution of some themes of different epochs? Or is it going to be this kind of what I would call return to the matrix, racing around, erasing human personalities?
Well,
And things
yeah,
like
I
that.
mean, I mean, that's the
That's
big
the
question.
Elon Musk question, right?
Well, that's the big question of the
Yeah,
moment. We're going to
yeah,
talk about
yeah,
John Michael Greer,
yeah.
but I think there's also an element of it. Believe it or not, I mean, I really do believe this, and this is totally going to be germane to what we talk about today. There's an element
And
of
we're
it.
actually talking about it now, which is really
Well,
funny.
I
Yeah,
know. You
yeah,
know
yeah.
that book, Thomas Cahill, How the Irish Saved Civilization.
Yeah, his whole series was kind of good, wasn't it? A lot of those.
And he's a good writer too,
Yeah, yeah.
makes it even better, right?
Hmm.
He writes well,
Yeah.
which is a lost art, trust me. Um, but in that book, how the Irish, I mean, he really talks about how the Irish monks, in the Middle Ages, were the ones who preserved Western civilization,
And
and
how did he say they did it again?
by copying Plato,
Yeah,
and
right.
making, the Scriptoria, where they were copying all the ancient wisdom and then preserving what at the time would have been the modern wisdom as well, right?
Hmm.
I think that's enormously important. And then you get a little bit farther, a little bit later in history, I think another person who deserves a lot of credit, to a family that deserves a lot of credit, are the Medici, who Cosimo de' Medici and his son
Sure.
Lorenzo, Il Magnifico, the Magnificent. And Lorenzo was, I mean, both of them were extraordinary patrons of the arts and learning. And
Good people too, or kind of like when we look at Renaissance times, could they be that and do an important task and still be kind of rat bastards in their private
oh
life? Or
yeah,
what were the? Yeah, yeah, yeah,
so what?
yeah. Right.
But what they did, I mean, I think actually probably uh, a comparison to Elon Musk that could be made.
Okay.
But talking about, like, Lorenzo he was the patron as a kid. He basically adopted Michelangelo
Hmm.
as a teenager and had him basically educated by the finest minds in Europe, meaning Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino. And they would sit at the table and have these extraordinary conversations every night for dinner
Yeah, yeah,
about philosophy or what's the nature of love or whatever it happened to be, right? And Cosimo started it and Lorenzo continued it. They went around the Mediterranean collecting manuscripts, like, you know, ancient manuscripts from Plato and from the Hermetica and everything they could find, and they saved it all that stuff could have been lost. Kind of,
Mhm.
kind of like what happened by accident much later with the discovery of the Qumran and the Nag Hammadi.
Sure, sure, yeah.
You know, but
Or
but
the
but these
tragedy,
guys were
inversely, the
actively
tragedy of
trying.
the burning of the library in Alexandria or something,
Yeah,
right? You know,
it was.
these
It's
that
like,
this is bigger than the burning of a library. This is wild stuff that
and
history
there,
kind of turns on
and I
such
have. I
moments.
mean, you got to have a lot of respect for people who try to preserve, you know, what has been best in human thought and endeavor, right?
Yeah.
Including art. I mean, and that you can see with the Florentine Renaissance, the explosion of talent that happened in this really tiny window of historical time,
Mhm, mhm.
in whether in it's an architecture or sculpture or painting or, whatever, or philosophy. I mean, I don't know if you've read much Pico de la Mirandola,
I
but
have, yeah.
but it it
Just when I used to
you
teach
read that stuff, it
humanities.
gives you hope for humanity,
It does. Yeah.
So I mean, I think there's that's very commendable.
And there's a sense too that this great Catholic historian, John Lukács,
Mhm.
who was he taught at a Quaker college his whole life. And he was, he was one of these people who could give so much credit to Owen Barfield, but pretend that Owen Barfield had nothing to do with Rudolf Steiner, almost de facto, right?
Another one of those. Yeah,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
Mark
yeah.
Verney.
Yeah. And although I think he's going to come around, or remember Mr. Clavin, who was on the show, all of a sudden at the very end, Spencer Clavin, he had to admit it probably all points to Steiner. Who knows? But
Wait.
Owen, this John Lukács, probably influenced by Owen Barfield in this way of thinking, would say that mathematics is nothing more than the history of mathematics. And that's kind of what you're saying about preserving things. That to understand math today is to know the whole history. They say, like, in a very reduced form, Chesterton said, if your first novel sounds like Charles Dickens, that's great. But if your third one does, that's horrible. But imitation is the highest form of flattery, or this
Right.
notion that before you break out of the forms as an artist, you might demonstrate that you can draw the human body somewhat satisfactorily and things like that. But the history of philosophy is philosophy, and
Right.
that we're yeah, go ahead.
No, I just thought you were talking about imitation as a serious form of
Yeah,
flattery.
yeah.
Salvador Dali dropped actually one of my favorite quotes, especially when I'm talking to young musicians or poets or writers, and that he said, and I think there's such a wisdom in it. He said, "I became myself by imitating Missonier."
Hmm.
And I know that. I mean, whether you're a poet or, I mean, certainly when I started writing songs when I was a teenager, you start by imitating the things you like.
Yeah, yeah.
Eventually, you get into your own thing, and you
Hmm.
have your influences, and they're still there. And even though Harold Bloom later called it the anxiety of influence, like it's an Oedipal conflict,
Hmm.
you know, um, it's I mean it's enormously useful. I mean that's what speaking of Michelangelo, when in their apprenticeship in the bodegas back in those days, they would imitate.
Sure.
They did it out, every day. Like that was their whole job. They would imitate other painters or imitate life um, for hours a day
Yeah.
until which is part of their apprenticeship, right?
Well, even Stendhal says a novel is just a mirror walking down a street, like holding it up to
Mhm.
society. And he was known to be able to do wild impressions of people, which is again like the ability to put yourself into another person's place.
And
What
that's
is
what's
it to
so great
be?
about
Yeah,
parody.
yeah, and even
Parody
that
is the same
gesturing.
thing, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
tell, parody is hard to write, um, because two things: you have to know the thing you're parodying.
uh-huh,
So to know it that well, you got to love it to a certain degree, right? To make fun of it, you have to
yeah,
understand it. So you can't really write parody without being a fan.
uh-huh.
You know what I mean?
I do get it. Huh. So if we wanted to, why don't you state? Let me read John Michael Greer's text, all
Yeah.
right, or his tweet. Because I think this is going to be it's a just a few paragraphs, but it's going to be about astrology. But I want to put this type of thinking into again whether what are we actually going through now at the meta level. So John Michael Greer, who's been on the podcast, look him up. We got to have him on again. I give him
Hmm.
the integrity. He just doesn't do videos, so we just do audio with him. but he enjoyed the conversation. So did we so much.
Yeah.
Here he was a few days ago talking about uh, Aries. Anything that happens at 0 degrees Aries is a reset button in astrology. When the sun
Hmm.
reaches 0% or 0 degrees Aries, that's the spring equinox, the beginning of a new astrological year. When an outer planet conjunction happens there, or within 4 degrees or so of the beginning of Aries, it marks a new age of the world. And the slower the planets, the more important the change of ages will be. A Neptune Saturn conjunction in that location, especially since it's literally 0 degrees, is huge. The only outer planet conjunction that would pack more clout is Uranus Neptune, and that hasn't happened at 0 degrees Aries in recorded history. The last time Saturn and Neptune were in the beginning of Aries was 593 BC. That marked the beginning of the actual age, which I'll call line, kind of coming out of circle one. The birth of philosophy, formal mathematics, prose literature, the emergence of the first democracies, the spread of literacy outside the scribal classes over much of Eurasia, the birth of scriptural religions, and much, much more. All those is fascinating, by the way, each one.
Hmm.
We're heading into another change of equal magnitude or even more intense, since this one is closer to the 0 point of Aries than the one 2,618 years ago. Hang on
Hmm.
to your hat. Um, so
Hmm.
first of all, let me just ask you, in your words, as a Catholic, as a Christian, how do you say, sure, we can think this way? How do you appropriate that personally as a person of faith, in the sacramental tradition? And
Well, I wrote about this a couple times in the last year,
yeah,
precisely. And so I wouldn't call myself a practicing astrologer, but I know astrology. And I know this is, I mean, what he's saying is, in fact, I saw one today by this guy, what's his name? William Stickovers, I think it is. I don't
yeah.
know if that's probably pronounces it, but he was also on X this morning. He said basically the same thing. He got a little bit more detail because he wrote it in a longer form than JMG. But this is actually we were talking about this last time when we remember when we were talking when you were saying what's going to happen next, and I'm like, I
Yeah,
don't know.
yeah.
And that's because I think but this Neptune and Aries thing is like a game changer. It really is.
Bro, it's so
And then
serious.
certainly with
Yeah,
Saturn there
yeah,
too, it's like it's woo, like John
yeah.
Michael Jr. That's big.
And
And I
again,
think
yeah,
in this guy, so this guy's just talking about the Saturn Neptune or I think Saturn Neptune conjunction. He's saying that and this is I knew this already, but I'll just run down
sure. Yeah.
because Saturn Neptune that they do get conjunction every once in a while because Saturn takes 28 and 29 years to go across around the zodiac.
Mhm.
Uranus takes 200 300 years. Um, but so if you go through history, the last time that this happened, the last time that Saturn was conjunct to Neptune was 1989, which I remember this moment.
Berlin Wall and everything.
Berlin Wall.
I was there
Um,
the summer after. Yeah.
the freedom when Nelson Mandela was let out of jail
Mhm.
after 28 years, which is a
Right.
Saturn,
The
right?
Soviet Union just didn't exist anymore. It just happened
Right.
overnight. That's a great image for people to hold on to. Things can just like ice, just kind of break. They can break, you know?
Yeah, and it's not, and that's why I think what he's talking about, you can kind of go through time, and this is, one of the ways you learn astrology is you look at the planets and see what happens
Mhm.
in the world, or you look at planets and see what happens in relationship to a person in their chart, right? It's it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's basically what it boils down to.
Mhm.
And so if you go through history and say, well, what happened the other times this conjunction happened? Another one was 1952 to 53. And this guy says the death of Stalin reshaped Soviet power, the Korean War armistice is signed, and the Cold War strategies intensified. Then
Mhm.
1917, the Russian Revolution, right? And
Mhm.
he got a bunch of them. I'm going to go read every single one of them. Boston Tea
So are
Party
you
was one.
talking about how astrology works in general, or are you talking about like this is an epicycle within the
This
larger cycle of the
this
JMG
I'm talking
storyline?
about this is the Saturn
Okay.
Neptune conjunction.
Yep. Yep.
because Saturn in astrology represents structure and like the father,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
rules based,
Hmm.
whereas Neptune is opens it up, right? It's very
Yeah,
mystical
yeah,
and
yeah.
spiritual in one
They
side.
say it's the eighth thing, right? It's beyond. They thought there was seven. It's just kind of the
Mhm.
darkness beyond that thing
And
lurking. Yeah.
so here, I mean, I think like everything else, that's not all good or all bad
Hmm.
with a conjunction like this. So, for instance, and actually, this guy's Sikiver or whatever his name is,
But just for me,
he
when is your conjunction versus John Michael Greer's? So,
no, it's right now.
I know, but like he's talking about this one, the last one, which was 2000 years ago. He's
No, he's
talking
talking
Saturn,
what
Neptune. Oh no,
he's
okay.
talking about the last
The
time Saturn and
Aries.
Neptune were in Aries. Yeah.
Right. Gotcha.
So these
Gotcha. Okay.
the other conjunctions I just talked about were
You're
not in
helping
Aries.
me. You're helping me. Yeah, I
And
sense
being in
that. Okay.
Aries,
Yeah.
like he said, is hit the reset button.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
really is.
So you're taking this mini epicycle and you're putting it against a wild new background. That's what we're
Yes.
going. That's right. Yeah.
And so but here's the thing. Um, I mean, I think there's a lot going on with this. I mean, there's so many ways this could play out. Um, one of the things that I think John Michael has been talking about recently in his posts, and also that Sikiver was just saying in this post, I never knew him about him until this morning, is that they point to a serious disruption of the world order. Oh yeah, should we talk about tariffs now?
Right, 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 right. And I
You
just see
know,
this separation, which could be a good
well,
separation or a bad
and the weird
separation.
and the
Sometimes
weird
people are
thing is,
codependent and they need to pull things apart. Sometimes they need to work on those things that get us together. And these are all the big questions going on. Go ahead.
but the weird thing to me is that I shouldn't say weird, interesting, is that Donald Trump, he kept announcing this was coming, but he said he's not going to do it till April 2nd, right? And he said it
Okay.
was because he's superstitious, meaning, and the implication was, I'm not going to do it on April 1st, it's All Fool's Day.
Uh-huh.
But I don't, just looking at it from an astrological point of view, like, no, he was waiting until Neptune was in Aries.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
what he
yeah,
was waiting for.
yeah.
And because and then I will go to my tomb claiming this, that I assume either Trump or somebody around him knows about this. They never say it out loud. We know that Nancy Reagan used an astrologer while she was in the White House
Oh, yeah.
and
Or the
counseled
foundation of
Ronald Reagan.
Washington, D.C. has huge astrological things going
That's
on.
right.
Our
But
good
here's
friend
the
Bill
thing.
Kaufman, he's written on that subject. Yeah.
But the other thing is, it's not only they're not the only ones who know about this. And
Right.
those I have been calling the archons for the last 5 or 6 years, meaning the assholes who are trying to run things, right?
Mhm.
Who are, so I got in a big argument with my friend. Love this guy, but he thinks
Somebody,
I follow
somebody
him.
whose name you care to drop or no?
No, I don't want to
Don't,
out
don't.
him.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
But he's a good friend of mine,
Yeah.
musician. I mean, I love this guy. But we were having an argument about all the stuff that's going on, what's been going on, and he's mad that I don't hate Trump enough. I'm like, well,
Uh-huh.
sorry, but but I pointed out to him, this whole what we saw happen 5 years ago when in lockstep, all the Western nations started with the Build Back Better sloganing, right? Or the new normal. And they were all in lockstep, locking down their nations. And, you know, it was, and you could see it was not a good thing. But so these guys also know astrology. And like we've talked with Guido, and Guido's right. They're always 10 steps ahead, but they're trying to stay 10 steps ahead of this one, of Neptune moving in Aries and then the conjunction with Saturn. They're trying to move ahead of that one. I don't think they can. But I think
Yeah. I
what
wouldn't
we've
know.
seen happen for the last years is they have been trying to rig it so when this paradigm falls apart, they're in charge of the next one.
I would say the same thing in a different way, but not a contradictory way in any respect. But yeah, in all these cases, the epoch we're going into, Aquarian age, you can get into that. What are some of the themes of that? You also posted, and I talked with a friend of mine who knows who's from Hindu culture, but the Kali Yuga, the Kali Yuga, some people say. He said, oh, in India, it was great. He just said, like, in India, it would be like, I said, did you guys, in your day-to-day consciousness, you were aware that this was kind of coming to an end in different versions, just like astrology,
Mhm.
have different visions of when. And again, I don't think either you or I need like an exact date, but there's different themes is the way I look at it,
Right.
different themes approaching. But I see kind of what we're going into. You would use archons, and I don't disagree with that at all. But
It's a useful term.
yeah, it is a useful term. But I think, we're going into the Aquarian age, and there could be a true or a false one. We're going
Mhm.
into we're going into a world of greater harmony, but that could be like a beehive, a termite, a termite mound, or an ant heap, versus a world as if people really mattered. And that's the
Mhm.
Elon Musk phenomenon again. So I say, in addition to what you're saying, I almost think the archetype of the true and false kind of community we're looking at, a reductionist one, the worldview of the census, is it almost gets us, for me, Michael, it gives me more sense of agency. So whether it was being run by archons or not, it gives me, or it's a complementary view of we know the blueprint, and the blueprint was there at the time of St. Paul. He knew that the Antichrist, nestles right in the heart of Christ, and there would be a false perversion of this. This is Illich's whole
Right.
schema. It's Giorgio Agamben's whole schema.
Hmm.
Um, but I think those two views are kind of important because we know,
Right.
because we can look at everything. Is this leading us towards, so look at young people again, or computers. Is this leading us towards any type of world? Elon Musk might be a good guy, but we need everybody to say on their own, what type of world do I want to live in? What is my relationship with technology and things like
Hmm.
this?
Right.
Yeah,
And I think that all is relevant because I think,
yeah,
kind of like the good side, bad side thing.
yeah.
So with Neptune moving into Aries and then later Uranus or, moves into Gemini. Uranus moves into Gemini, I think, September.
Okay.
Uranus moving into Gemini suggests kind of an explosion or innovation because like John Michael said, and this is true, when those outer planets move into a new sign, it's like a new era happens. And we're
Mhm.
having a lot of new era stuff happen at the same time, right?
I think so. Yeah, I'm just saying, I honestly think so.
And
And a lot of people I respect who are very grounded just say they think so. Institutions that we took for granted are crumbling. You
and
know,
so
what's
quickly.
gone is the era of that way of looking at schools. What's
Hmm.
gone is the era, which again, education is a scarce commodity handed off in rooms. Gone is the way of hospitals and institutionalized medicine, where
Hmm.
it's commodified, it's scarce. You have, a weird kind of clericalism about the whole thing. This is institutions, the way of doing politics. Let's hope that beyond what's currently going on in American politics, for me, can we get rid of the nation state? I've been telling you, I've been teaching this Catholic social thought class, and the popes, they could consecrate. They could no longer give their consecration to absolute monarchies. Good for them. They, but then when they saw democracy and they wondered, does error have rights? That whole evolution. Then they really get into the conscience. I still
Right.
think that's very potent when you look at quotes about conscience and the increasing incarnation of the word. But they never consecrated the nation state. They consecrated democratic practices to reach decisions. They consecrate a
Well,
lot of things, but it's the nation state. I hope that crumbles too. And you mentioned beyond like the tariffs. I don't know if the tariffs are going to lead us to the beehive or the other way, but I think it's this upcracking that's very interesting.
well,
And we'll
and I
find
think
out. And we'll find out. Yeah.
it was interesting that maybe a month ago, Marco
Yeah.
Rubio, when they were interviewing him, when he first was appointed, he said, "No, we're not no longer a we're not the sole superpower anymore. This is the
Yeah. Own it.
multipolar
Own it.
planet." And which he's right. You should just acknowledge that. And what's been happening is the American government's been spending so much money that we don't even have what I would
I know,
93.
but we're bombing Yemen as we speak. It's
Yeah,
really
I don't get
tough.
that.
Yes, to
But
keep the shipping lanes open.
to go
Go ahead.
back
Go
to
ahead. Yeah.
Neptune and Aries and Uranus and Gemini, um, that well, Uranus and Gemini is like technology. So like it could be a good thing.
Right.
Because remember when the internet came out, it was the democratizing internet. And now it's
Yeah.
as we saw over COVID, it's a
Yeah.
potential site of oppression and
Hmm.
surveillance and control. So there's a potential there, and
Yeah.
because Gemini is the you know it's ruled by Mercury, which is the messenger of the gods, right? So it's about
Hmm.
communication and stuff like that. So and also Gemini, it's twins. It can go either way, like the good twin, the bad twin.
Hmm.
Um, so I think when I look at that, that just tells me, that screams Elon Musk to me.
Hmm.
Who I think on the one hand, I like, that he liberated Twitter and allowed people to speak their mind for the most part. On the bad side, what's the hell's with the transhumanism, right?
Yeah. My
Um,
son says that the storyline with him is he wants to be like the good guy who gets control of AI for the good people so he can go to Mars as opposed to
well,
bad guy Sam Altman, something to
mhm.
do with Mars.
And
And I
I,
want to stop talking about freaking Mars. It's just
what, yeah,
it's such a
and that's the,
horrible way of like analyzing our situation, you know?
but I think you see that with the U.S.
Mars,
government too. I
Mars,
mean,
Mars.
with whether it's whatever the technologies, I mean, you know, well, we could not pursue them, but other people will. You know
Yeah,
what I mean? So it's kind of a weird thing, right? I mean, I
yeah.
don't, and then it gets into their hands with the wrong people, right?
Is that the
Like,
story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice?
but so get this. So maybe 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, maybe three. Let me see, when was this? What year is this? This was 2023. So July 2023. Um, I wrote a poem based in kind of a spiritual experience I had when I was 24 or something. You were speaking of the Kalki avatar or of Kali Yuga, right? Because of the
Yeah, yeah,
Kali
yeah,
Yuga, what's supposed to happen at the end of the Kali Yuga, which is the Dark Age in
yeah.
Hinduism, the Kalki avatar of Vishnu is supposed to show up and kick ass and take names. Um, and
But that's probably the same thing as our Saint Michael thing, right? There's two faces of that.
we'll get
Saint
so so
Michael's going to beat you know, beat the bad
so it was
libtards versus
1987.
mhm.
It must have been 1987 or so, 86, 87. So I had this kind of vision on over Lake Huron that the Kalki avatar was coming across,
You've
who's riding a
alluded to this before, right? Yeah, tell me. Yeah.
who's coming out riding on a white horse, right? Coming across Lake Huron. And I didn't know what it meant. It was like, it was very much my imagination. It was not like I'm going to go become a Hindu right now. It
Right.
wasn't like that, but it was certainly an entrance into the imagination for me. And it kind of came back to me 2 summers ago when I was across the road cutting hay for my cows because we're in the middle of a drought and we're running out of hay and we couldn't get hay from anybody. So I was cutting this tall grass that's across there. And I wrote a poem, and I'm going to read you the last two stanzas of the poem because
I'm
it's
in.
totally what we're just talking about.
Wow, yeah.
And here's how I wrote, but I wonder what he was telling me, the blue god, as he disturbed the Huron moving west. This was in the summer of 1987. Before Tiananmen Square, before Berlin, before we found ourselves placed in the possession of the archons, before we were digitized, before we were silenced, before we were formed in the image and likeness of a digital god in a garden of nothing.
Mhm.
I hear deep thunder as the storm comes creeping closer, and I realize it is time I finish this scythe work. There is no wisdom in tempting nature, no matter how poetic the blade one holds. And here's a kicker, because this is a quote from or not the Upanishads, from the Vedic scriptures. And yet I wonder if the blue god still breaks the waves of the universe. And here's the quote: He who will kill by the millions the thieves and the rogues who have dared to dress as kings in this age of darkness.
Oh, yeah.
And I think,
Hmm.
you know, we may be at that moment.
Yeah.
At least, where, or at least an iteration of that moment.
I can put it in a larger context. I think, let's get as clear as we can. So you you're more conversant with Heidegger than I am. But lately I've been reading, if I've mentioned this, Christos Gennaro. But like what we're seeing now, the age of the archons, or when Guido's on here, what happened after 9/11 and so forth, something radically changed. But like, how about this whole claim? But you give me feedback. As I understand it, um, Heidegger got from Nietzsche this wild reading of the West that really comes from kind of those things we were talking about last week, natura pura, metaphysics,
Right.
that that the ontologies of Western metaphysics that came from Plato had totalitarianism as their end, essentially since the timeline that coincides with the axial age that John Michael Greer is talking about, right? That
Hmm.
you get the that a certain reading of Plato gone. It's a left brain thing. You need these. You need power. Um,
Hmm.
how would you tell that story? So Heidegger, we came up with a metaphysics that prized onticity, just the thingness of things.
Right.
Um, and not connection with them. And so what Owen Barfield, the Romantic poets, tried to work against is all of a sudden we had this outness. Stuff was out there. We weren't implicated. We didn't participate our exteriors anymore. So then all we started to do is mess with things, science, just and raping Mother Nature. So there's actually a timeline that again that some of these phenomenon that you're saying happened in Tiananmen Square, we start to see the breakup. And now, I use my favorite essay is by John Cowper Powys on the Père Denis, the boiling cauldron. That all of
Hmm.
a sudden the cauldron has been on the boil for a while, but now it's really
Right.
boiling, and institutions are falling down and things like that. But that historical timeline, what's your feedback on
Right.
that?
Well, the thing is, it depends which Heidegger you're talking about, right? Because if it's
Okay,
the early
so
Heidegger, you know, like the being in time Heidegger.
no, the one right,
Yeah.
the same Heidegger who wanted to raise up Rilke and say we need a new way of thinking.
Well, yeah, that's where I'm
Yeah,
going.
yeah.
And I think one of my favorite things, I mean, my favorite book by him is certainly Poetry, Language, Thought.
Okay.
And where he's got probably my favorite essay by him. I mean, the question concerning technology is up there, but
Yeah, right.
what are poets for? Right. And here's what he says, if I can find it. It's a great quote.
Mhm.
Uh, to be a poet in a destitute time means to attend singing to the trace of the fugitive gods. This is why the poet in the time of the world's night utters the holy.
Mhm.
This is why in Holderlin's language, the world's night is the holy night. And I
Yeah.
think, I've been, I've been banging on about this for a while, but I think, so certainly my understanding of poetic metaphysics owes a lot of debt to Heidegger in
Mhm.
that right there, because, and I think we live in a historical moment where poetry is at its nadir. People
Yeah,
reading
yeah,
poetry or people entering into the poetic is at its nadir. I remember reading, gosh, I was 20, so before the Iron Curtain fell, so it was in the 80s probably, reading in the Detroit Free Press an interview with somebody who had gone to Russia, and she said, "Well, it's amazing. If you go to Russia, people are on the buses and they're reading poetry."
yeah, yeah,
Um, and not we don't.
yeah.
Um, and
Americans, we buy books, but we don't read them. Russians borrow books and they read them.
we have book
Yeah,
furniture.
yeah.
But but I think
Book furniture.
but I think especially with Neptune moving into Aries. I mean, certainly Neptune has a lot more in common with poetry than with technocrat
That's my
techno.
point. So if you do the same phenomenon of participation, alienation, and final participation, those people who are reading Ian McGilchrist, and I think it's there in William Blake, but here's that three-part schema. Age one, prior to the actual age, was feminized and it was very right brain. Then the left is a little bit of an exaggeration. Is a left. The next period, the actual age, the era of the book. Oral culture is circle one, participation, feminized East. The Western line is actual age, the dominance of the book. These
Hmm.
institutions start growing like a certain form of church, hospitals, and things, and that the where we're moving now, the Aquarian age, Aries and Neptune, the thing beyond is a reintegration of dark and light, the feminine and masculine, but it's also the higher resolution of the right and left brain, where the right brain is kind of dominant again, but doesn't get out of control, but uses the left brain like a tool. And we need
And
that.
I
Yeah.
think that's what's what kind of coincides with what you're describing there, and I think it's
Mhm.
true. Uranus moving into Gemini is very much a left brain tech, you know,
Yeah.
communication kind of approach. But on the other hand, with
And maybe it
Neptune
could be
very
baptized too.
feminine, Neptune being very feminine, moving into Aries, that starts a new, and I think it will, and you can already see it. Uh, it starts a new uh, impulse, we could say in Steinerian language, of spirituality, and also like we talked last time, we were talking about how I'd been editing these books that were discussing quantum theory and stuff,
Mhm.
and and I just wrote this on the Druid Stairs Back about how people who step in or stumble into the other world, with the fairy kingdom. There's a lot in common with that to the discoveries of quantum theory in
Yep.
the
Yep.
worlds
Yep. Yep.
hypothesis or
That
non.
idea of quantum theory, again, it's pop psychology, it's pop this, pop that sometimes, but it's real. That we would say again, the masculine era, everything could be out there. And then it was the return of the oppressed, right? At one level, you had the insights of Freud and Charcot and people that the rational mind is not as rational as we thought. Like there's chaos
Mhm.
lurking right there. And then at the other end, at quantum physics, uncertainty was introduced there at the very basis of matter.
Yeah,
And now
yeah.
that stuff is just coming into, it was lurking there. We haven't known what to do with it. Now it's just trying to say, like, I'm here, deal with me. Like this,
Hmm.
yep,
And interestingly, another, talking about, huge changes afoot, and I think that's
huge changes.
it is. And so even with this whole thing with the tariffs, right, which you've seen the
Yeah.
people on the left losing their shit about for the last few days.
Everybody's an
The
economics
stock
expert
market
right now.
lose its
They
shit
love
about
the
it.
word, they love the musical Hamilton, but must have hated his economic policy.
Oh, but so I just happened to catch this morning on X, this British woman talking about it. She's like, no, this is actually, it's kind of ironic. So you have this kind of muscle being exerted by the United States. I mean, almost like, okay, here's our last big thing we're going to do to the to the whole world.
Yeah.
We may be taking your USAID money away, but we're going to do this before we go. And so with disrupting that, and she was saying, and this it speaks to us that this and actually I saw an interview with Tucker Carlson. I didn't see the whole thing. I just saw a couple clips of Tucker Carlson with Scott Bessent, who is the Secretary of the Treasury, I think,
Okay.
and who was saying Bessent, he's saying, look, at 80% of the wealth in the stock market belongs to the top 10% or maybe less than that of people.
Right. That whole thing could be
But-
blowing up.
And he
Yeah.
said the next um, 12%, or the 12% of the next demographic owns whatever percentage, I can't remember what. But he said the rest, which is 40% of people or more, are in debt.
Yeah.
And he said the economy is not set up for those people. It's set up for the people at the top making all the money,
Yeah.
which is we
Yeah.
saw that through COVID when they closed all the small businesses and all the big box stores and the top guys the wealth migrated from the bottom to the top.
It was the greatest wealth transfer in world history.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he was saying this is a broken system.
Hmm.
And he's right. And
Yeah.
so this other thing I saw with this British woman talking, she's saying, no, this will be good for localism,
It could be.
which
I would,
is
yeah.
I don't know, I don't have any idea, good or bad, what's going to happen with what's going on. I have no
Me
idea.
too.
I
Me,
don't,
me neither. Yeah, that's what I was
but
gonna
I
say.
do
I have,
know,
yeah.
it does give me hope to see um, power taken away from the people at the top and just giving the people at the bottom half a chance, right?
Yeah.
To do something.
Two things about that. One is the claim from people who oppose the tariffs is that it will work as more of wealth transfer. And I don't know, but the way I approach this whole thing is, I don't know. I guess I've been biased against tariffs. I just don't know. But I would say this is that I think everybody could agree nobody who's running things has ever named to us like what this is all about. So
Mhm.
this idea of like oneness, becoming one, again,
Mhm.
that can be a good thing or it can be hell. It could be the oneness of the womb, the
Well,
oneness of
mhm.
blackout drunkenness, the oneness of a sick orgy, satanic orgy or
Right.
something. Or it could be a oneness, again, as if individual persons mattered, not a crowd phenomenon, but a community phenomenon. This
Hmm.
most of the oneness, I think you and I would agree. The reason I'm open to this, I can't condemn the tariffs thing unknowingly myself yet, is that I'm not theoretically opposed to a separative tendency too, like subsidiarity, something going back. And I think a large of the opposition or a large part of the kind of the anti-Trump thing or this world unity piece, you and I both find that world unity piece really scary. Spin the color wheel really fast, you just get gray. The United Colors of Benetton, it's not
Hmm.
colorful at all. But the this notion that we need separative tendencies and unifying tendencies, and again, it's right there in the Romantic poets.
Hmm.
We have separative tendencies and unifying at the same time. But if they're unifying without separative tendencies, that's a regressive solution to the problem of alienation. It's like
Right.
back to the womb. It's like back as if none of this mattered. So, I mean,
Yeah.
those are some of the principles I use as we're going through this time. I just don't know. I don't know. But
I
yeah,
I don't either, but I do
yeah,
know
yeah,
that I mean, one thing because it's already happened, like you can see it in real time and have for a long time, is that you talk about, the nation state, and I think what's worse than the nation state is a one world government,
yeah, yeah.
and
Who's going to
in,
police the
in, a,
policeman
in
is
a
the fundamental
microcosm,
question. Yeah,
one a microcosm of the one world government is the EU, which
yeah.
I think, as far as I'm concerned, is probably one of the most evil organizations on the face of the earth.
It strikes me as it is like this Kaja Kallas, this crazy Estonian, like they've got in charge of
Oh,
foreign
I
policy.
know.
It's just if somebody wanted, it's going to sound so kind of like anti-feminine, but if somebody wanted to create an image of somebody who just loved, took a new genius to the love of war and bombing, she might be it. And
Yeah.
Christine, the whole Lagarde, it's all crazy,
Well,
crazy.
I think what you see there is
They're
um
unelected. They're literally unelected.
well, we heard for years, didn't we, Mike, that well, the problem with the world is it's run by men. Let women run things.
Yeah. I
Change.
guess
And
that's
then
my
then they
only
get into
point. I'm not saying anything against women, but it wasn't as simple an answer to that idea as years ago. Again, there's
So
the
anyway, I'm going to
yeah,
read
go
you a couple things. So
please,
this
please.
woman's name is Jasmine Birtles. This is the British woman, and she's got a whole thing, but she said Trump's tariffs will usher in a new world order, which is what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
This is the start of living, working, and trading locally, I think. It will take years, but it's going to happen. Globalization is on its way out. And I hope that's true.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm into that.
Yeah. It was
Um,
where we were going. The other direction was so horrible. It's all this like, and again, we're not saying I don't think you and I are saying Trump wants to stay outside this sick game of like rare earth mining. Um,
mhm.
the number, I don't know how many people die in Africa, probably with USAID money, a lot of them, but in other ways, but others just, corporations going in there, the Algerian wars over oil, Blood Diamond, that movie, that's all globalism. The seedy side of globalism, some of that stuff. And I don't have the answers into where we're moving, but if, there's a lot of African economists I know who are again, asking just to be let alone over there. Stop
Mhm.
sending us all your aid. There's parodies of "We Are the World, We Are the Children" and everything. That is a
I
great
know.
part of all of Africa. Like,
It
go
sounds
Yankee
nice, right? It's
do-gooders,
good
go
propaganda.
home, go home. They're all saying, "Go home, leave us alone."
Yeah, and so ex case in point, I think probably, you know, some, not everybody, but some of the women leaders across the world, especially leaders of nations, were the worst under COVID. Like in this one, there's this guy tweeted this morning. Never forget what Jacinda Ardern did to New Zealand. Behind the soft tone and polished speeches was one of the most authoritarian crackdowns in modern Western history.
Mhm.
And he points out, under Ardern's rule, citizens were locked in their homes, families were separated by checkpoints, the unvaccinated were segregated from society, protesters, peaceful, brave, and ordinary Kiwis were beaten, smeared, and silenced, and it was all wrapped in the language of kindness,
Remember
right?
Laura Bush when we started bombing some country in the Middle East said we were doing it in the name of women's rights. Again, it's
Yeah.
like on both sides, like these criminal entities, the Bush families, the Cheney
So,
families, the Obama, the
so
Clintons. Yeah.
yeah, so I resist, for
Yeah.
instance, the temptation, which is lazy thinking, to think, wow, we just give it to women, that they're going to be nice
Yeah.
and caring. No,
Yeah.
not necessarily. There's a dark mother as well as a light mother,
Yeah,
right?
there's Rapunzel who
Yeah.
locks her children in a tower. There's the she-wolf that
Mhm.
eats her own young. As again, for the male, there's people play with this. There's actually good books. There are a lot of new agey ones, but the shadow masculinity, the true masculinity versus this new online culture of subjugation of women. So much men, overreacting to the trans phenomenon, which
Mhm.
was not good. There's this kind of new masculinity that's nothing short of messed up, dark. So there's a
Well,
very
yeah,
dark
to
masculinity and
overcompensate.
there's a dark femininity. Sure.
And I think not, I don't think the new masculinity or whatever that is a response to the trans thing. I think it's a response to men being basically emasculated over the last generation or two,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
boys are you told not to climb trees, it's too dangerous,
Hmm.
or you know, to discourage boys from being boys,
Hmm.
to fling around terms like toxic masculinity. And boys are so aggressive. It's a feminization of the male, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
I think that has not been healthy. And so I think what you're seeing with this kind of very butch, pro-masculine thing, performative, is a
Yeah.
response to that. Because that,
Yeah.
which is, kind of, you got to expect when that happens.
Yeah. That watering down of
Eventually you're going to
gender
get
is a
pushback and
necessary
it's going to be
recipe for a
caricatured, right?
hive, right? That
Mhm.
watering down of gender is a necessary recipe of the hive,
Hmm.
a requirement of the hive. The
Yeah.
uniform. Ernst Jung saw the advent of the uniform, where instead of this kind of complementary intersubjectivity that used to
Right.
happen between men and women, there was no one way to be feminine or just one way to be masculine, but there was this dance of the genders. And then in the industrial age that was building the beehive and everything, you had to water down both genders. So we were just like asexual beings. And that was a real assault on masculinity. Anything
Hmm.
distinct about men and the way they might perceive things. And again, it was an attack. Think of what Madison Avenue did to women. Saying you need to look this way, you need to wear these clothes, you need to do these things. Just
Well,
thick.
and look what OnlyFans has done to women, right?
Yeah, right.
Um, because I think what you're saying, and I can't, it always strikes me in the weirdest ways. So last week I was editing a book it's a book of kind of autobiography by this woman about my age.
Mhm.
And in there, she had a photograph of herself, probably at 19 or 20. And I was like, oh, wow. Because she's, just a normal, pretty girl without any embellishments. And I were from, filters or makeup or whatever. And she was like, I was like, wow, that's refreshing.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah,
You know what I mean? Because we get bombarded with, and we're talking about the maybe the caricature of masculinity that we see
yeah,
out there. And there's this character, and it's not even a femininity of, I don't know what it is. The hypersexualization of women, but there's a caricature that's being promoted of women that is couldn't be more artificial. But the thing is, you get bombarded with enough times, you get inured to it, and you start thinking it's, even not consciously, but subconsciously, you start to think it's normal. And then you see picture of a girl, normal pretty girl from 1982, and you're like, wow.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, I didn't realize how contaminated my imagination had been.
And remember Wilke, if we were talking about Heidegger and everything and how important that, and I want, um, I, there's so many women, this notion of like when Rilke said, at first women will come to ape the ways of men, right? In his, collected letters, Love and Other Difficulties and so forth. He had a lot to say, but it's a both and. The assault to stop the world from the war against women is a theme. Carl Stern, who had, along with Merton's Seven Story Mountain, his Pillar of Fire was the second great conversion story in the 20th century. And his The Flight from Femininity or The Flight from
Yeah,
Women.
it's a great book.
Yep.
Wow.
Von Balthasar is great on this. You're great on this, Mike, and Sophia versus Ariman. The attack on femininity is especially violent during our time. And again, I see how this can sound patronizing, but in the hands of somebody like Rilke, the attack on it is real men have to, understand that, again, it's probably not a swashbuckling, what is the call of masculinity at this time? But then because in this time that's coming in with this age of Aries and Neptune, the age of Aquarius, femininity, the darkness, the underworld, light and darkness combined, all these gifts, the gifts we so need now are involved in that like great tradition of femininity
Mhm.
songs and so forth, But I think that understanding for me that larger kind of metaphysical war going on the nature of what is femininity. Nobody can say, just like we can't with masculinity, what exactly it is. All I know is that there would definitely be a perversion attempt, a perversion of it attempted by the powers that want the technocratic world, the people as dots, an ant farm type of world, and that to become aware of that would be the central front for me, whether it's Madison Avenue or the nanny state, the central front of everything we talk about as the culture wars, kind of
Mhm.
was for Eric Fromm and some others. What do you think about that?
No, I think
It's kind of a large part of your work.
let's
Sociology.
thinking, lazy thinking once like for instance, not to switch the topic, but because I'll go back to this in a second. Lazy thinking will tell you that all rich people are bad, all poor people are good, right?
Mhm.
Which is not true, right? I mean, you can have, I mean, it would be nice to have altruistic rich people, and I think there probably are out there, at least partially. Um, and I mean, case in point, so Elon Musk, who's kind of an interesting figure because, like I said earlier, there's some stuff I like, stuff I don't like, but he, those astronauts were stuck up at the space station for 9 months or whatever it was. And
Yeah.
he sends one of his rockets. Why didn't the US do it a long time ago? He sends one of his rockets, rescues him, takes them back. Nobody says anything.
No, and
It didn't even hit the network news, right?
but my politics would be so you'd have the left, loving NASA, but not Elon Musk's rocketry, and the right would love Elon Musk rocketry as you do for that reason. I'm against rocketry. I think it's little boys
Yeah, I
talk
don't
about
like it
a
either, but
good,
he
a good and
rescued
bad
people who were
masculinity, this kind of
stranded.
phallic love, 100%, 100%. But
Yeah, never.
yeah, so the left needs to clean up their action because they still love that kind of like adolescent male science. Let's just go far. Let's just blow up things for the sake of blowing up
Speaking
things. Yeah.
speaking of which, remember when Jeff Bezos had a rocket and it looked like a giant penis?
That's all I can. Well, I forget that picture,
It
but
really did.
yeah,
It
it's
was like
always been phallic. This whole rocketry
it was
thing.
like it was like like that scene.
October Sky. Since Werner von Braun, he should have never left his hometown. Bill Kaufman uses that as this idea of like we raise young people that you need to go far. You need to go far. Werner von Braun should have stayed where he was and right in the corner where he lived. Once they
Yeah,
take you and
that's
they
what I
take you to
support. Yeah.
Harvard, you're just going to be building rockets that blast men. It's very violent. Um, we need to laugh
It's
at rockets. We need
I
to
could do
laugh
a
at
whole
rockets.
Freudian thing on this, right? But
And
anyway,
you don't like missiles, nor do I.
to go back to the
Go.
feminine.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you want to probably one of the most biggest misunderstandings of me by people who read my books is I think some people, not everybody, some people, very minority, but some a strong emotional minority thinks that I'm going to be all pro-feminist all the time and I'm like a goddess worshiper. And that's kind of lazy, right? That's not what I'm doing at all.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
You're
actually
the
what
you're
I'm
the
trying
male
to
Joan
do
Chittister. You know.
is
Oh,
bring
actually, I like
balance,
Joan Chittister. What's
you
that?
know, okay, but I mean big part of the my sociological project is to bring balance into the
Yeah,
world,
right, 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 right.
to
Yeah.
not to go fly into the other polarity.
Hmm.
Um and just to be honest, I mean, really to be honest, in fact, I wrote about this yesterday and yes, I wrote for somebody. Um that I was complaining about allegory because allegory does not leave the imagination anything to do. Like John Bunyan's A Pilgrim's Progress, which I cannot read. Um,
Owen
it
Barfield thought the art form of the future of this era we're talking about was going to be a higher form of allegory, almost like an allegory, not like the Everyman or Pilgrim's Progress, but maybe an allegory with authorship. I don't know. Okay,
I
go
don't know
ahead.
what that
Yeah,
means,
yeah, I'll
but
see.
I but But
I think
allegory
I'm
doesn't
right
leave the
on that. I could be
imagination any
wrong.
room. You got no room
Yeah.
to move, right?
Yeah.
And so
But the
that's why
play within the
Bunyan.
play is how you catch the conscience of the king, right? That type of kind of getting a truth by an allegory. We can only see it another way. That might be one of the deepest ways of getting
Well,
truth. I'm just
and using
wondering.
that example, that one
Okay.
backfired on Hamlet because he thought he'd catch the conscience of the king, but what he did is he basically telegraphed to the king, "I'm going to try to kill you."
The insight, if you're talking about marriage or something, the insight is one of these ones of the coming age, right? That, like, if you look at a family, the dad wants to fix his kids, the wife wants to fix the dad, the kid wants to fix this person. And you can't work for a day in ministry without seeing these wires getting crossed all the time. So I'm saying, the paradox, which is kind of like the play within the play, is how you catch the conscience of the king. In this era we're moving into, for me, it's one of these paradoxical logics, light and darkness, romantic
Mhm.
poetry. But the idea is the best thing you can do for, Bonnie is work on yourself, right? Become less of whatever annoying
Not,
traits you have. The best thing
try
I can do
not
for
being
Amy.
such a jerk. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 right. And that's just how and then people, when they see you working on yourself, that's the way they can get the message. They're never going to
Hmm.
hear it like, hey, you should put you should change this behavior. I know I probably couldn't hear it. Then I just started admiring people this Father Ed who died, who at the end of his life was just kind of sitting there at the end of his life doing penance for every can't really talk
You
about
just
it. Yeah, no, it's kind of he would just do penance for every unkind word he ever said to somebody. Just thinking about it, if he could call it to mind. I thought
Mhm.
that's a pretty cool way to live.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that type
Important.
of thing. So I just my point, my small point is that type of logic of, am I now? You judge literary forms. I'm not trying to own this argument, but is that an allegory? Because that type of behavior, that psychology, I think, is very foundational. It's kind of like 12 stepping, bottom up, feminine conversation, community, not crowd.
That's not allegory though.
Huh.
Allegory is a direct
You kind of tell
correspondence.
the story in a different, yeah, tell the story in a different way so people can see it, but a near miss.
But it does it always with a didactic purpose, right? Where it
Awakening.
doesn't leave, like we talked with, doesn't leave the imagination any room to grow.
Hmm.
Whereas, and so the example I used when I was writing that essay, so I contrasted the Pilgrim's Progress
Okay.
with Sophia or wisdom in Proverbs 8, where, which does invite participation of the imagination. But what the interpretive history of that, especially in the Christian West, or even in the East too, has
Mhm.
been to confine that beautiful piece of poetry to an allegorical interpretation, meaning wisdom equals Christ,
Right, right, right. Augustine
right?
was big on that one. Yeah.
But it's a really, that I see where they get that, but it's kind of a stretch.
I find
Or the
it
same thing
to be a
with
stretch. Yeah.
to read the Song of Songs as
Mhm.
allegory.
Yeah.
Well, you could, but it's really an erotic marriage poem.
Yeah.
It's an
Yeah.
epithalamium, right?
I agree with both those. Yeah.
And those allow the imagination to enter it
Mhm.
because you don't have, okay, and this is what it means behind, you know what I mean? And though that's and I think, no, er, I'm looking at the book right now. Harold Bloom calls about the anxiety of influence, but I would
Mhm.
call it the anxiety of interpretation. That there's an anxiety in the gatekeepers that, in fact, they hid away the Song of Songs from the laity for centuries because they were afraid they'd interpret it the right way.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and when they finally did, no, this really means God's love for the church.
Mhm.
Okay. And that's all it means. Stay in your lane, right?
Yeah.
There's an anxiety that people are going to interpret it the wrong way. So you
Yeah.
have
So coming into this age of
superstructure.
Aquarius, it's going to be bottom up. The whole question of authority, top down or bottom up. This is being challenged in our time. That's the Rod Dreher phenomenon, the Viktor Orban phenomenon, kind of the post-liberal phenomenon, that they see the breakdown of some of these institutions. And in our own way, Aaron Weinacht at like Front Porch, he kind of
Mhm.
sees it. I think Adam Smith sees it, Tara would. But like when we're looking at Patrick Deneen and these people doing the post-liberal thing, um, and again, there can be the bemused kind of the thing for me, the interesting thing right now is the pot is on the boil. I don't think the Orban thing is the answer, or necessarily, these are agents of influence, or I should say agents of change. And so I'm kind of watching the spectacle as like things rising and falling. But
Hmm.
you know, uh, I think all of this stuff is related at this time.
Yeah. Now,
Yeah.
my thought about that is like, you know, thinking hierarchically, right? The top down, th- the authorities say we can't interpret this as a love poem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so let's stick to God's love for the church.
Uh-huh.
Um, on the other hand, a bottom up structure, it's still a hierarchy. It's just an inverse one, right?
Oh,
What
totally, totally.
what I think what 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 Neptune moving into Aries suggests to me is neither one of those, which actually is a dissolving, and it's something maybe that we've never seen, like we talked last time. Like I don't know what's coming,
Yeah.
but it's something pretty unique, and I think that's what we're heading into is something that's really unique, and that
The model for beauty, this would be for me, because you use the word hierarchy, and I think I was trying to, oh, some of the other topics we've had with guests and so forth. I can vaguely remember a couple of weeks where I felt I was pressing people on this. But so even in this Catholic social thought class I'm teaching, Leo the 13th was just so overtly hierarchical. Then all of a sudden with Dignitatis Humanae, where the beginning of the takeover of this was attempted, that of the takeover of what democracy would mean. But the so a lot of people would say you can't get outside of hierarchy. But if there was a way outside of it in a world we're moving into, this would be the answer from Owen Barfield. You could bring in Dostoevsky, who said that beauty will save the earth. Well, what is beauty, says Barfield? Beauty is this increasing realization, and we're seeing a good form of technology in this with holography, is where if you look at the Sistine Chapel, where the microcosm cannot be there without the macrocosm and reflects
Mhm.
the beauty, and the macrocosm cannot be. So that the concept of beauty we're seeing, it's not set theory, but it's this paradoxical polar logic where, like that you would find in a community, not from a crowd, that the increasing Mike Martin's growth into Mike Martin's Mike Martinness can only be done with the rising of the tide of his community, him serving others in that community and so forth. And according to Barfield, who in this essay, The Meaning of Beauty, um, and it's a compilation called The Rediscovery of Meaning and Other Essays. Um, if we take Dostoevsky at his word as being somewhat prophetic, I think the Catholic Church should be taking this one very, very seriously. Beauty as the template. It's web theory in one sense, but it's not technological like that. But where the microcosm mirrors the macrocosm, it's right there in
Right.
holography. Yep.
And I think, who was way out of the curve there is von Balthasar, right?
Yeah, in one sense. Say more about that.
The
You've read
first
more. Yeah.
sentence of the first volume of The Glory of the Lord is beauty will be our theme,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And he was, I mean, that was in the 50s that he wrote that?
Mhm.
60s? A long time ago. Um, but I think, so what I,
Before
my
we get there, it'll be the Age of the Warlords, I think, by the way, as a
yeah,
footnote.
my intuition tells me uh with Neptune moving into Aries, it's more of a you're you're using the language Age of Aquarius, but I think that's probably um maybe and I hate to the thing is these terms are so weighted with whatever like a liberation of consciousness or
Yeah,
experience
don't use jargon. We promise not to use jargon.
you,
Yep.
you can't there I don't think we have language for what we're going to see yet. That's part of it,
I'm
right?
willing to
But
take
I
a
think
whack at it.
like what I was talking with people having stepping into the other world or some of the findings of quantum theory. I
Mhm,
think those things hint at what might have what we're heading for,
mhm,
right? Where maybe you could say it's like people, and I think I think one of my touchstones, and I think is really important here, is the kind of Celtic church, which is more of a decentralized hierarchy. It's more
mhm.
diffused. You know what I mean? It doesn't
Which
have
doesn't happen to be working in the Orthodox Church of America right now, all those
no.
autocephalous churches, right, right. But it can
Um,
work. It can work.
and it can work, and I
It
think
can work.
that what you saw with the Celtic churches is
And it's working with mushrooms and trees, the people who are studying like ecology. We have
Actually,
models for this.
mhm.
Mhm.
Actually, one of the things I wrote in that essay, I don't remember how I put it, but that you can think, how does the imagination work, and how do
Yeah, right, right, right.
these vocabularies of images we have, like you have them. Like in dreams or mysticism, there are certainly images that speak to us in a vocabulary that hopefully we can understand. And poets kind of also use a vocabulary of images that sometimes they're conscious of using and sometimes they're not, right?
Yeah.
And but isn't it also true, and this kind of touches on Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, there's kind of a mycelium network
Okay. Yeah.
of images that,
hmm
it's under the surface where I think they pop up and who knows where they're from, right?
Yeah, and I think that's what's happening is because like when I this Gerald Hurd gave me this image that I referenced earlier is that like we have this area of rationality, which to tie some of it together for me, but I think you're better at this than I am, is that Nietzsche's critique, Heidegger's critique of Western kind of positivism, the outness of things, is that we started focusing there and around the corners of our kind of left brain focused vision, that form of attention, which was all focused, not ambient is around the corners you had like Heisenberg kind of over here, and you had the instance of Freud, which we could take him as insights, but that couldn't represent reality. But it seems to be reality, and that's what I hear you saying, is reality has this kind of polar logic to it, this
And
pulsatingness to it. It's a life. It's not just a dead thing that we dissect in order to understand. And that's
right.
breaking through at our times. You and I both feel that resonance maybe with some of the tariff talk, like some
Mhm.
ice breaking. When you were talking about the other times of this conjunction, even with Saturn, the breaking up of the Soviet Union and things like that. And, I'm always talking about the two tendencies, the unitive and the separative tendencies. And right now, we think we're being good progressives, or I just always talk about oneness, as if, there couldn't be a smarmy type of like infantile oneness. But you and I are, I think starting to breathe a little easier, saying, gosh, it doesn't seem like this total consolidationist totalitarian thing is quite as much in its advanced stage of at least that one kind. It was in its mop-up operation of that one kind. Trump could be the advent of another kind. We just don't know yet. But right now, there's a little bit of a breaking up, which I think is like the bubbling cauldron for me. That we might be able to breathe a little bit for a while. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's and I'm kind of proud of myself. I predicted this a year and a half ago.
In what specifics?
When I wrote in my blog, I was just looking at the big astrological movements over the next 2 years. I'm like, wow, it's over for the archons. And I think you're seeing that right now,
Could be,
which is
could
why I
be.
think they're panicking, right?
There's definitely a
Because
sense of
don't
panic.
you see that?
There was a panic.
There's a huge panic. I mean, there's a panic about let's continue the war with Ukraine.
Well, today's
There's
a day of rage, right? We'll have to see what the numbers are. And I'm not trying to mock it out, but I don't think the numbers will be all that impressive. This idea, what we're saying is without emotion, there doesn't seem, this thing is happening. And there doesn't seem, it's going to probably continue because it doesn't seem to be a coordinated response. Nobody can articulate what they really agree or disagree with. It's just this kind of blind rage at Donald Trump. And
Mhm.
that when he actually asks people to leave their house about it, they don't, because I don't think they know exactly what they want to say. Was Cory Booker just talking for 20 hours about this and that? Was that an articulate response? Was this kind of like trying to pump air into the deflated tire of Bernie Sanders? Is that a meaningful response that he represents some type of like credible
And they
opposition? No,
and they keep
no.
doing this stuff,
Yeah, yeah,
the Democrats, and their approval ratings keep going down.
yeah.
They're about to get to the point where they can't go any lower than zero.
That's the idea. There's no meaningful response. I wish there was. I'd probably be part of it. I could probably craft my own, but
All they have, yeah, all they
yeah.
have is rage, right?
Blind rage, blind rage.
That's all they got.
Yeah,
Oh, we hate Trump. That's their platform, right?
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Love Trump. Hate means I hate Trump.
and in fact, what's her name? Sasha Stone was saying,
Who's Sasha Stone?
Sasha Stone is she's a uh bona fide lefty, but
Okay,
she abandoned them when she saw how crazy they were.
okay.
But she said no, they would cheer and celebrate the crashing of the economy. In fact, they would encourage it and they would try to make it happen if it hurt Donald Trump. I agree.
Possibly. Yeah.
And
It would have to be a
that's
controlled
exactly what we
demolition.
saw.
Yeah.
Actually, in the 2020 election cycle, I'll never forget. Because as you know, I did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016. But in 2019, 2020, the economy was humming, and I remember telling my wife, "There's no way this guy's going to lose the re-election."
Mhm.
But then, and I'm still suspect this happened that with all the stuff with worldwide with the archons or the World Economic Forum or whoever it was calling for lockdowns and all this other stuff, and all the Western nations jumped in line.
It was
It
weird to
destroyed the
behold.
economy, which assured, I don't want to say assured, but it certainly made it less possible that Donald Trump would be reelected
Mhm.
because that's people vote about their pocketbooks, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I suspect there was cheating involved, but it doesn't matter. It's the optics.
I
It's
like
how
the people who can't pretend there was cheating because cheating doesn't happen. We're like, no, we know there's been cheating in so many elections before. Even like Kennedy, like Chicago,
Yep.
the machine out in Chicago gave Kennedy the election. But we
Mhm.
can, two things can be true at the same time.
I
Like
know.
Kennedy might have benefited from cheating. On the other hand, I think he was killed by the CIA.
I do
And
too.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Oh, it's so and the
And the
funny
CIA
thing
is bad. And the CIA
with
is
the whole
bad.
cheating thing, right?
Uh-huh.
So in 2020, Donald Trump is saying there was cheating. 2016, the Democrats were all saying it was cheating. He was what do they call him? You know, I can't remember the term they were using, but they were saying,
I
he's
found
not.
them to be by and large equanimous, maybe because they felt like there was no winning that one, that they rigged as much. I have no idea. But there was some of that. The but the yeah, my point is like there's just fraud everywhere. I guess the other one that this brings out is our friend Guido, and I think I'm with him, would say that this is kind of like to your point, or how much any given individual, we're all fallen, how much they would maybe hurt themselves to get at their enemy. In There Will Be Blood, Daniel Day-Lewis kills his son, over money. But Guido would say power. You can eventually get enough money, but you can never get enough power.
Hmm.
And we'll have to see. So it's kind of commonplace to say the banks are more important than power. But just one person, Preparata, would say, no, no, power is the thing. Power is the thing. Prepotence, just that thrill of having your boot on somebody else's head. That's the real thrill. That ties in with some of the child sex trafficking and
Hmm.
things like that. So to your point, if somebody would say these people would never kind of hurt themselves in their pocketbook, I would say, I don't know. You could make a good case that people would hurt themselves to maintain power. Yeah.
No, but I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about just like normal electorate,
Yeah, fair.
right? Because
Uh-huh.
most, working class people, they're going to vote for who lowers taxes and
Sure,
keeps
sure.
keeps things going, right?
Yeah.
And if the economy's in good shape, you got a good job. Even
Mhm.
remember Dennis Miller, who is not known as a liberal, um, during the Clinton administration, and
You mean he wasn't known as a conservative, right?
and he was pro Clinton
Yeah.
because the economy was in good shape, and I'll never forget because people were going on about Monica Lewinsky. He said, "You know what? I got some money in the bank. The economy's doing well. So if the little chief executive has to check into the Oval Office every once in a while, that's okay with me."
It's politics for so many people, right? Yeah. Yeah.
But that's kind of a standard, right?
Yeah. I
Pardon me.
like when the moral purity test comes to national politics every so often, which is a tricky,
Yeah.
tricky one. So what are you doing today?
I don't know. It's kind of crummy outside.
Yeah, for me too.
It's drizzly and slightly cold.
Yeah.
How about you?
I've got
You-
to meet up with a few friends in college town where I worked at Geneseo, and then I'll probably watch the first of the Final Four. My team, Michigan State, lost last week. I'm not a huge sports fan, but yeah, because it's crappy weather here, I might turn on some college basketball
Well,
later.
actually, yeah, my son works at a sports bar. It's going to be a big night for him.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Does he work at a chain sports bar or just kind of a
No,
local?
just I don't know, some sports bar in Ann Arbor.
Yeah, yeah. Did you order nukes for your bees, or what are you doing? Were you just trying maybe find a hive?
No, since my bees survived, I'm gonna split the one
I thought
hive.
you said they didn't survive. I'm glad to hear they did. At least
No,
one.
no, no, they did. One of them, I don't know what happened. Queen lost or whatever, but they were
Yeah.
gone November, October.
Oh, okay.
They got robbed out, but my other hive is doing very well. They made it
Right,
through the
right.
winter. So I'm gonna, as soon as the dandelions start blooming in a few weeks, I think I'll split them around then.
Well, cool, cool, cool. All right. Well, this was another fun conversation.
Hmm.
Everybody, thanks for listening to the Regeneration podcast. We'll regenerate again next week. Our friend Guido was he's in Italy, and we're gonna have our friend TJ on, who's a guy we began with back in the day. So
Yep.
TJ, I invited him this morning, but I only invited him yesterday. We fly by the seat of our pants here at Regeneration. Thanks for listening.